Okay, so what we're going to be discussing for this tutorial is how to work with motion capture data. Now, I've gone online and looked around and found some motion capture data of a walk. And what we're going to do is take this, move it to a control rig, and then we're going to edit it a little bit so that we can get some better data. Editing motion capture sometimes be really difficult because you have so much data there. If you look and see the animation that I'm playing, I've got a keyframe for every frame down here on the bottom range slider or time slider. And it looks like a total of somewhere around 119 frames. So I'm just going to get my range down to where my animation is, just so I can get rid of that extraneous amount of time there. Okay, now a couple things we'll see about this is, first of all, it's a walk, but it's motion capture walk. So they started in one spot, they walked down to another spot, turned around and walked back. Now, a lot of times we'll get this motion capture, and this will be our raw data, and our goal here, our objective, is to turn this into a cyclable animation. We want a walk cycle. We don't want to animate one ourselves because it takes a lot of time and it's difficult. And we want to get some of this natural swing of the hips and things that's really difficult to do with hand animation. So we've decided, okay, well, we've got this download from online. It's a pretty good walk. It's fairly generic. I'd say there's a little bit of hip sway there, and you'll see when we put it on a character there's a lot of hip swinging. Alright, now here are some of the problems we see with it. Now, first of all, look how that right foot moves over the center line. So we've got him starting out somewhere around the center, but those feet, that foot, looks like he's kind of turning as he walks. Alright, well, we want to get rid of some of that. We want to get rid of that diagonal motion. We want to turn this into a simple walk cycle. Alright, so there's a few things we can do before we move this onto a controller. Right now we just have rotational data and translation data, right, on a skeleton. Okay, in order to turn this into a walk cycle for a game, let's say, we have to make him appear to be walking on a treadmill. Two things we need to do is get rid of the data that we're not going to use. Now, we're only going to use a walk cycle. And a walk cycle, for those of you unfamiliar with the cycle, basically starts out in mid-motion and ends in that same mid-motion, which means that right foot being off the ground, it starts out here, right foot off the ground, which is great. It starts out in this mid-motion. I don't have to cut anything off the beginning. We'll see him walk here. And then, boom, that's the mid-motion we want to end on, and that way it creates a cycle where we can constantly loop it and make him appear to be moving forward. So the first thing I want to do is just delete all information after that final cycle. And let's say frame 27. Right here, this is before he goes, so let's look at frame 0 and frame 27. And his position of the right leg, which will indicate the position of where he is in his walk cycle, is about the same. This is about as close as you can get. We can go to frame 26 here and see how far the right foot is behind. We really want the right foot to be somewhere in the middle. So one of these two. It's either 28 or 27, and I'm going to choose 27 as the frame of the point when the walk cycle happens. So the beginning and end point of the cycle. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is, now we do this before we map out the control rig. We want to get rid of all the data that's unnecessary. So I'm going to open up my graph editor here, and you can see there's a whole lot of data. And now I have just my hips selected. So I'm going to type in, I want to select all my skeleton. So I'm going to type in select minus HI here, and that basically says, okay, I'm going to select everything underneath that hierarchy. Now, oddly enough, you have to also reselect that hip. So now we can go into our, so what basically I selected everything under the hierarchy, then I have to select what it is on top of the hierarchy, or I could do it separately. It's just nicer to do it all at once. Now I can go to edit and delete in my graph editor. And what I'm going to do here is delete from a particular time, right? So we have a start end. My start will be frame 28, which is after the frame that I want to preserve. And we can say the end time is 120. This will get rid of everything. Go ahead and hit delete keys. This means that my animation will only take place between one point of the cycle and the next point of the cycle. Okay, so that fixes that. Gets rid of all that information we don't want. Now, we've got to get rid of some of the translation data on the root node. Why? Because we can't have this translating forward. If we're doing this for a walk cycle, for a game, we cannot have the translation occurring on the animation or inside the animation clip, because that's going to be controlled by the whatever controller you're using to move forward. You have a walk forward if you're playing a first-person shooter or whatever, or third person. Whatever is going to control the character is going to control his actual forward movement. What we want it to look like is that he's walking, just like he's walking now, but on a treadmill. So we're going to create this kind of walking in place effect. And to do that, we're going to select our hip node here, and you can see all of our movement channels. And I don't know why they have keys in the steels, but it's not really that important. What we really want to look at is our translate. We don't want him translating in the Z. And you can see this kind of straight line. That's his forward movement in the Z-axis, which is towards the camera here. So we're simply going to get rid of it. I'm just going to select all the keys. Now, excuse me, just getting over a cold here. So we could select all of these and just hit delete. That works. One thing you're going to have a problem with is if you have 600 keyframes and you're selecting each one of these and you see how it's going to show you the tangents on all of them. I've had this crash my computer several times when I try to select too many keyframes. It just can't handle the volume of information it has to show you. So it's a lot easier to go to edit, don't select any of the keys, and just hit edit and delete with that channel selected. And we can say all. Hit apply. And you can see it will delete just the channel you have selected. It's a lot easier, excuse me, it's a lot easier than trying to delete keyframes like this, because I guarantee if you have all of these curves, right, and you try to select all of them, and you have, let's say, 600 keyframes to select, it will crash. It will crash most computers. So that's why we don't want to select all of these. Okay, so now, if we look at them from the side, we'll get this effect of walking, and I'm going to now change my range here to 28, or actually let's change it to 27. And we'll see we're starting to get a walk cycle. He's walking in place, and now we could translate him forward in Z using some type of controller in the game engine, and it would work fine. Now here's the biggest problem we're having with this data, is that he's walking, now that he's no longer really walking in space. Now see how he's moving from one side to the other? Right, so generally speaking, if he was walking in a straight line, this would not necessarily be an important step, but I see that his translate X information here, and you can see it. I'm loading it up in my graph editor, taking a look at it, and it's kind of shifting. I really don't want it to shift, right? I want his hips to be in the exact same place in the X-axis. So once again, I'm going to go to edit and delete. Boom, and that's gone. And now unfortunately, I have some really off data. And the reason is because those legs are still rotating, right? They're still trying to move off. So if you look at him from the front, he's looking really weird because translation X, and I really don't like getting rid of that translation X. I'm undoing it right there. Because the hips move back and forth, they actually literally translate back and forth, and it's getting rid of a lot of that data for me because I don't want him moving globally in the X. And I'm going to redo that. Just select that and delete. So it causes a little bit of problem for me. I'm editing this mocap data, and you can see how his legs are kind of turning out and things are awkward. All right. But I had to remove that X translation because otherwise he's shifting slowly. So he looks fine from the side because we're not seeing that X movement. Looks pretty good there. But if we look at it from the front, there are some issues. And most of those issues are about these joints here rotating. And you can see some of the data here. And they're rotating. Now, trying to deal with Oilers, we can't just do things like we can with translates. We can't just delete the whole channel here because Oilers are dependent on one another. It's because of that rotation order, and there's a hierarchy involved, that we can't just go around deleting channels here or editing them. You have to be really careful. Okay, now so this is something we can't fix in the raw data, right? It's something that we can only fix in a control rig, which is what we're going to do next. Okay, so now, first thing I have to do before I get to the baking of the data. Actually, I take that back. We'll bake the data and then we'll copy the pose in the control rig. So now I've got this guy all set up with human IK, right? He's got a definition of the character. So we've reached a point where we pretty much can't edit any more data in the raw capture. We're down to rotations, and trying to edit these rotations just gets a little crazy because these all work together. It's really hard to edit these Euler rotations individually. All right, that's why we want to edit translations, which means we want to move this data to a control rig, and that control rig uses IK to give us data on the rotations of these, right? It turns this data into translations on effectors. So I've got this guy defined here. Now we need to create a control rig, right, or bake him to a control rig. So essentially, we don't really have a control rig set up for him yet, but I think if we just click on Bake to Control Rig, because his skeleton is defined, it should work just fine. And let's bake him from making sure our time slider is selected here. Let's see if that, okay, so because we already had him defined, it creates a control rig for you automatically. And here's our control rig. Remember, the purpose of that control rig is to be able to edit this stuff using inverse kinematics or inverse kinematics / forward kinematics setup. And let's just maximize this so we can take a look and see. All right, now what we want to do, and one of the things that would be hard to do with the raw data, we've got this set up here, and we can now edit all of these simply by using the translations, right? So we put translations onto our effectors, which are running this IK system, and that is then putting rotations onto our the rest of the skeleton. So using IK system is creating rotations here based on our translations of the effectors, and we can select all of them right here. Now using a little trick here, we're going to go up to this full body. I'm going to click on that because that is going to give us keyframes. Now I'm going to select in the outside window here, which will select everything in that body. So all of our effectors and joints, right? And we're going to mirror, we're going to match this frame 0. So let's look at frame 0 and frame 27. They're not matching, which means if we play this, we're going to get this big kind of twitch. See that twitchy hiccup there? You can see it right here. All right, let's stop that. So we're going to go all the way back to frame 0. And because we're in full body here, and because we have everything selected, we can right-click and say copy. And we can go to frame 27 and we can say paste. Now, alternately, you could have copied frame 27 onto 0. I like to copy the beginning onto the end. All right, now we are going to get a hiccup between here. Here's 27, 26, and here's 27. And that hiccup will still be pronounced. We'll have to fix that. But it'll be slightly less annoying, or slightly less pronounced than it was between 27 and 0. So we still have this point, and we're basically going to have to move some parts without moving others, because if we copy this on 26, then we'll just have to deal with 25. All right, so here's some of the most important things we're going to have to change up. See how this foot, once again, this is a real problem. We need the walk cycle to be forward in that x-axis, moving straight forward along the z-axis. So one of the things I need to do here, and now I've got translation data, and I can fix this. Let's bring up that translate x, and we can see right here where it happens. Here it goes across the line. You can see here's our translation. So it's, instead of moving in a constant, because here's the x-axis, right? Now when you're doing a walk cycle, you don't move your foot around the x too much. You move it around a little bit. You don't always walk in a complete straight line. So sometimes we don't really want to get rid of all this data because you do move your foot around. In some cases, you want to keep some of the data. You just want to make it less extreme. In that case, we can select all of our keys, and I can then use my scale, and I'm using my middle mouse button, that creates the pivot, and I can actually scale that down so that it's much less pronounced. So I still have the motion in the X, but it doesn't actually cross that line. Now, alternately, if I really want to make this nice and static, I can say, let's just delete it. If I have these selected, I haven't crashed my computer by trying to select too many of these points, I can just hit delete. And what happens, it no longer crosses that line. Now, one of the things we want to do here, which is essentially the same thing, is I'm actually going to move this outward here. Because I really want this walk cycle to exist split between this plane here. Because we're going out to a game, it has to be a pretty even setup, right? Pretty even walk cycle. So I'm just moving out and seeing where do I want this value to be. And let's go in here. Where the value is now is 8.693, and we can maybe say 9. Maybe I want this value to be 9. Where's our starting value down here? 2.24. So obviously pretty far inward, right? Pretty far in towards that line. I want this to be a pretty straight looking walk. So I'm going to select this, type in 9, because we have to have that value there, and we'll make it consistent across there and delete that. Now see, here's something we could not have done with the raw data because it was rotational data. Now we're still getting some weird rotational data up here. Why? Because we didn't really fix the hips and the way this thing is rotating. We simply fixed the translation of those. So it's translation of these effectors here for the right and the left leg. There's still all kinds of data on the rest of this walk cycle, but it doesn't really work. And you can see that knee coming out and the hips kind of bouncing around. And that's data we really have to fix. It's really hard to see, though, on this character, because all we have is a skeleton. It's really hard to see, hey, this is going to work or this isn't. But so far we've gotten from this point, right, we've gotten a walk cycle that is a cycle, even though we're seeing this little hiccup here. So we've got a walk cycle that's at least happening as a cycle, and his feet are staying on a steady path right here. Now what we're going to do next, before to stop there, is let's take a look and see. The nice thing is we really don't have to do with too much rotation data, not right now. We really want to use our translation data as much as possible. Now here's our translation data, and we can actually see in this left hand, this is where I'm seeing the hiccup the most here. If you notice, here's that hiccup between 26 and 27. There's a few things that are hiccuping, and we can change a lot of these. We're not going to do all of that in this tutorial. I'm just going to go through and say, okay, hey, maybe I'd like to tweak some of the values here, right, between here and here. And if we select these, select these and see this is a fairly decent tweak, and we can see that there's an offset value, right? Here's our value on frame 26, or frame 25, 26. This is going in a steady motion, right? And then boom, it drops down. The value drops down, and that's where we're getting this hiccup from here to here. So, and it's happening on all three axes. So a lot of the things we can do, and I'm going to adjust frame 27. I want to make sure is exactly the same as frame 0. That keeps the cycle happening. So basically what I might want to do is adjust frame 26 so we get a smooth interpolation between these 2 points. And of course, you have to do this on all keys. And this one actually looks pretty smooth to me. This is one way of handling this particular problem. Let's move this over so we can actually see it. I'm not seeing it move much on this keyframe. You know, I have this selected. I'm just going back and forth to say, okay, well, where does it need to be with this keyframe? $25, $26. We just want it to look like it's moving in some kind of semblance of an arc. So if it's here at 25, here at 27, looks like we smoothed it out a little bit. Let's check it out. When we play, and I'm still seeing a bit of a hiccup between here and here. So where's 25, 26, 27? So all I need to do is pull it out a little bit in that X. And I can hit S, which sets the keyframe. Now we're starting to get a pop. What's really happening there, we can see a pop from the hips. But we should see a little bit less of a pop in the arm. And one of the things that's difficult about this is just have to go through and see, okay, what's changing. I got a pop happening in several places. And the position now, I don't see as much of a pop happening in the position, but where does that pop happen? In the rotation, right? So let's go and look at the rotation. And we can see, look at that. And here's how you look at this data. You've got this big pop happening here, right? This big difference between these values. And once again, rotation, really, really tough to deal with. Look at the rotation value that's here at the 0 point, and look at the rotation that's back here. And these should be matching. This value here and this value here. Actually, it's kind of weird that they're not. They should be matching between the frame 0. Let's just see what these two are. That's kind of weird. They should actually be exactly matching. So I'm just going to do this. Let's just copy and paste these keyframes. And interestingly, let's see. Now they're the same. Can't quite explain why my X did not change, but no, I guess it is the same. 19.2. Alright, so now what I'm really going to do is say, okay, where can I change it? So where can I fix this? One of the things I can do to make a smoother transition between here is to get rid of the keyframe at frame 26. Which will give me some semblance of smoothness. I'm not really seeing a whole lot of change. See, the problem is we really need to keep these keys at 27 exactly as they are down here at 0, although we're really seeing a big change between somewhere along my entire body. So let's go back to character controls here. Just going to select all of that, and let's try to get all of them again. Yeah, it's odd, it's not really copying and pasting all the keyframes. So let's try it on the 1. Right. Okay, so sorry for the slight interruption. I had to figure some things out, so I paused the recording mechanism. Alright, so we still have this little problem here of this hiccup between 26 and 27. And this is a lot of things you're gonna have a problem with a lot of these issues. And like I said, it's not easy to fix some of these problems because we have this swinging hip here. And what I'm doing now is I'm fixing it in the raw bait capture, which is very difficult and kind of tricky to do, versus capturing it, versus creating an animation layer that's going to override it. But when you're creating a cycle, you get to look. I looked through my motion capture data here for things like this, hiccups, especially like this. You have this hiccup, frame 26, right? in the regular line of motion, and then boom, you have a big difference between these two. And because you have a big difference between these two, and these are just the translates, we look at the rotates, we're going to see a lot of the same thing. Because this piece of data came from this point, and we're not using a hand animated motion. So really, one of the things that you can do to fix this, or to smooth this out a little bit, is that I actually delete frame 26 just from this particular piece here, and it should smooth out the change from 26 to 27 a little bit. I'm still seeing a bit of a jump, but it's a much, much, much smaller jump. And the reason is because it's going to interpolate frame 26 from frame 25. So you're going to get a point in which between these two, 25 and 27, that it creates an interpolated event. Let's select that here so we can make sure we see. What I'm doing is I'm clicking on single body element only so we see where the keyframes are. And we can even arguably delete 25. Right, so everything will be very smooth up to 24, and then we'll get a bit less of a jump between these two. Now that's just for this hip one, so just for this hip. So we might even want to do that for, let's say, everything. We want to create a smooth interpolation between one point and another. And now, as you can see, what's happening, and I'm deleting all the frame 26s from my rig. What's happening is it's smoothing out the animation, and let's just play it here. Now I'm seeing much less of a hiccup between those. And actually most of the hiccup here looks like it's happening between the rotation value. So we can see this translate Y. Let's just bring up that. And this is, a lot of this that I'm doing, like I said, becomes pretty tricky. So here's this, you see this spike here. And now I just practice I can kind of see that between one point and another here, that this data is changing pretty rapidly. I might want to get rid of that. And that's just a matter of experience, seeing where does this data need to be adjusted. So we can kind of smooth out these 2 points. Let's just select this here. A lot of times you just have to go through all the major effectors and see, yeah, see, look at that. Do we need that? My answer is no, we don't really need that. So what I do here is I actually try to tweak some of the data to create a smooth curve between the point at which, let's zoom in here. Here's our rotates. Rotates, like I said, a little dicier. We don't want to make any giant shifts here. And we're getting a little bit smoother of a result. And the process here would go on, and I don't want to spend hours going in and really tweaking these values. So what I'm going to do is create another video here for how to create the animation layers and smooth out some of this stuff without having to dig into the data here like I'm doing. I find this a better way to start working and getting rid of stuff that doesn't need to be there. But when we start getting to an area where we're just having trouble smoothing out this hiccup here, which goes from the beginning to the end of the cycle, and then we need to create animation layers. So now we can easily bake this on once we get a smoothed out version. We once again bake this to the control rig. So we can actually create, and I'll show you how to do this, by baking this back to the skeleton. And let's make sure we're on time slider here. Click on bake, and it'll bake 0 through 27. And once we've done that, we can now bake it back to the control rig, which will just give us data on a control rig for every frame. And now a true loop does not have the same frame to begin and end. So we can go from 0 to 26 here, and now we'll see what basically will be a true loop, which will give us a bit of a hiccup. We're still trying to get rid of that hiccup. And just put it back to 27 for a moment. And now that we basically reached our ability, because you can only tap in and massage that frame for frame data so much, now we're going to create an animation layer so we can adjust this, but non-destructively. Alright, so that is how to bring this in, characterize. We created the character here, but how to bake it onto a control rig, and how to start tweaking your mocap data to get out of it what you're looking for. And in this case, we're looking for a simple walk cycle that we can use in a game. And as evident from the side here, it looks pretty good. And this is one of the things that is difficult to get an eye for when you first start working with mocap data, is that from one side it works pretty well, but we can see where that real hiccup is right here, because all this area here is kind of flipping back and forth. We can smooth this out. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and stay tuned for the next video, which will be using animation layers to non-destructively edit mocap animation.